Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 10 of the most disturbing true cruise ship crew stories ever submitted to this channel. Crew members, housekeepers, deckhands, bartenders, night auditors sent these in, and these aren't campfire inventions. Too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-check the details, and they line up with shift logs and onboard incident records. A housekeeper assigned to clean a cabin that guest records say is empty. A night auditor watching a charge appear, night after night, for a passenger who checked out days ago. And a deckhand on a cargo deck who realizes he's not walking alone. Subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning, authentic horror over cheap jump scares. If you've worked a night shift and something happened you still can't explain, share your story in the comments. Your experience could be the next one we bring to light. I've worked housekeeping on cruise ships for 6 years, 3 different lines, and I thought I'd seen every strange thing a guest could leave behind in a cabin. Reservations get canceled, and nobody tells housekeeping. Guests disembark early and forget to update the sheet. Little glitches happen constantly on a ship, with 4,000 people moving through it every week. That's what I told myself about cabin 8112 the first 2 weeks I worked the Solène Horizon, that it was just a glitch. Every night my supervisor handed me the service list, and every night 8112 was on it, flagged for standard turndown. Every morning the manifest in the crew terminal said the same thing. 8112, unoccupied, no booking on file. I asked about it once, casually, and my supervisor didn't even look up from her clipboard. She said sometimes maintenance runs water through empty cabins to keep the pipes from seizing, and housekeeping gets looped in by mistake. It made sense. I let it go. Then I actually went inside to service it, and the bed had been slept in. Not just rumpled from housekeeping testing sheets. Slept in. One pillow with a clear head-shaped dent, the corner of the blanket pulled loose, the way a person pulls it when they're cold in the night. There was a towel on the bathroom floor, damp, used. I remember standing there with my cart outside the door, staring at that towel for a long 10 seconds, feeling the kind of confusion that doesn't scare you yet, because your brain hasn't caught up to what it's looking at. I pulled the deck plan on the crew terminal that week, out of pure curiosity, nothing more. And that's when the first real crack showed. Cabin 81112 wasn't listed as a passenger stateroom on the ship's original blueprint at all. It was drawn in an earlier version as a mechanical access space, then quietly reclassified as a suite sometime after the ship's last refit, in a revision log that had no engineer's name attached to it. A room that officially didn't exist as a guest space was being serviced, nightly, as if it very much did. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. A child's sock, small, white, balled up under the nightstand. A hairbrush, with long dark strands still caught in the bristles, sitting on the bathroom counter like someone had set it down mid-motion. A single flat shoe, a woman's size 6, tucked against the closet wall. None of it matched anything I would have expected from a maintenance test. Someone was living in that room. Someone who left before I arrived every single night and came back after I left, like we were on opposite ends of a shift neither of us had agreed to. I mentioned it to Tomas, a bar steward who'd been on the Horizon almost 20 years, longer than anyone else on the crew deck. I asked him, half joking, if he knew anything about the ghost in 8112. He didn't laugh. He set down the glass he was drying, looked at me for a second too long, and told me to stop asking about that cabin. Not in a way that sounded superstitious, in a way that sounded like a man giving me real advice about a real danger. He said, "Some cabins you just clean and forget, Marisol. That's the job." Then he went back to the glass, like the conversation had never happened. I couldn't let it go, though, not after that. I started timing my rounds so I'd finish near 8112 late, and one night, I stood outside the door for almost 20 minutes, with my cart parked around the corner, listening. I heard movement. Slow, deliberate. The specific creak of someone shifting their weight on old carpet. I knocked, softly, said housekeeping, Nothing. I tried the handle. Locked. Which wouldn't have meant anything, except I checked the mechanism afterward and realized the deadbolt on 8112 could only be thrown from the outside. Whoever was in there hadn't locked themselves in for privacy. Someone else had locked them in. 3 nights later, I used my master key when the do not disturb light had gone dark and the corridor was empty, and I let myself in fully expecting an empty room again. It wasn't empty of clues this time, even though nobody was inside. The mattress had been dragged off the frame and set directly on the floor. A chain bolt, the cheap kind you buy at a hardware store, had been screwed into the closet door from the outside, at a height that made no sense unless you wanted to keep something contained rather than keep something out. And on the wall behind the headboard, where the maintenance crew clearly hadn't bothered to repaint, there were tally marks. Dozens of them, scratched in, with something sharp, grouped in sets of 7. I reported it to ship security the next morning, expecting concern, maybe an investigation. What I got instead was a man named Delgado who listened to my whole account without writing anything down, then told me, very calmly, that 8112 was what corporate called an owner's suite, and that access above my clearance level wasn't something he could discuss, and that if I valued my contract, I should log my hours and let it go. He said it kindly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse than if he'd yelled at me. Nobody yells at you when they already know you can't do anything about it. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning of the part that actually terrified me. I got curious about the phrase owner's suite and dug through old crew newsletters archived on the ship's intranet, the kind nobody reads, looking for any past mention of 8112. I found a passenger list from 4 years earlier, a family of 3, flagged as having disembarked early at a port call in a country I won't name, for what the record called a medical transfer. Except the port authorities' own arrival log from that same week, which a friend in guest services pulled for me as a favor, showed no record of any medical transfer that day. A family had left the ship on paper. Nothing said they'd left it in reality. It got worse when I checked the employment records for the woman whose position I'd taken over, a housekeeper named Priya, who'd worked Deck 8 before me. Her file ended abruptly, 8 months before I was hired. No exit interview, no forwarding contract, no severance note, just a stop. I asked HR about her in passing, framing it as small talk. The woman in HR said Priya had requested an emergency transfer and left the fleet entirely. When I asked which ship she'd transferred to, for records purposes, the woman checked, then told me there wasn't one. Priya wasn't on any vessel in the company's system anymore. She wasn't on any system at all. By then, I wanted off that ship more than I'd ever wanted anything, but at the next port call, when I went to have my seaman's book stamped for shore leave, the officer at the gangway told me my documentation was flagged for administrative review, and I'd need to stay aboard until it cleared. Nobody could tell me who had flagged it or why. I stood on that gangway with my shore pass in my hand, watching other crew walk off into the sun, and I understood, in a very physical way, low in my stomach, that I was not free to leave my own workplace. The last piece came from a passenger, not a crew member. A woman named Odalise, mid-30s, traveling alone, who I'd started chatting with most mornings because her cabin was 2 doors down from 8112, and she always seemed to be lingering in that hallway at strange hours. One morning she grabbed my wrist, quick and hard, and told me to stop cleaning that room, that I was the 4th housekeeper she'd watched get curious about it, and that the others hadn't been transferred. They'd been removed, and removed didn't mean quit. Then she let go of my arm and walked away before I could ask her how she knew any of that, and I never got the chance to ask her again, because 2 days later her cabin was empty, and her name had been scrubbed from the passenger manifest exactly the way that families had been 4 years earlier. I did the only thing I could think to do. I wrote everything down on a folded piece of paper: dates, cabin number, Priya's name, Odalise's name, and I paid a deckhand working the supply barge at our next port call $50 to mail it to a journalist whose email I'd found covering maritime labor abuses. I don't know if it ever arrived. I never got a reply. What I do know is that 4 days after I handed that man the letter, my supervisor called me into her office and told me my transfer request had been approved, effective immediately, reassigning me to a different ship in the fleet, departing from a different port entirely. I told her I hadn't requested a transfer. She pulled up the file and showed me the request, dated, formatted exactly the way every transfer request on that ship is formatted, with my employee number and what looked like my signature at the bottom. I stared at that signature for a long time. It wasn't mine. It was close enough that nobody who didn't know my handwriting would ever question it. I left the Solen Horizon 9 days later. I never found out who was really in 8112, or what happened to Priya, or where Odalis went after her manifest entry disappeared. What I did find out, from a friend still working that ship, is that 8112 is still on the nightly service list, still flagged unoccupied, still getting cleaned by someone new every night. Someone who probably thinks, the way I once did, that it's just a glitch in the system, and that if they ask enough questions, somebody will eventually give them a real answer. I work security on cruise ships, and after 11 years, you learn the difference between a passenger who's actually lost something and a passenger who's performing loss for the cameras. Most footage requests are simple. Someone's watch goes missing at the buffet. Someone swears a waiter shorted their tab. Someone wants to see if their kid really did throw a shoe overboard. You pull the clip, you show them. They thank you, they leave. That's the job, 90% of the time. The man in cabin 7214 came in on day 2 of a 7-night Caribbean run, asking about a shopping cart. Said a housekeeping cart clipped his ankle in the hallway outside his room, and he wanted to see it for insurance purposes, in case it swelled up later. Reasonable enough. I pulled 30 minutes of Deck 7 corridor footage, showed him the timestamp. He nodded, said thanks, and left. I didn't think about him again until he came back the next afternoon. Same corridor. Different excuse this time. Said he thought someone had gone into his room while he was at the pool. Wanted to check who'd been in the hall. I pulled it again. Nothing unusual. But I noticed something while I was scrubbing through the footage with him standing over my shoulder. His eyes weren't on the hallway traffic. They were locked on one door, 3 doors down from his own. A crew access door, the kind guests aren't supposed to pay attention to, because it just looks like a maintenance closet with a keypad. I didn't say anything. You don't accuse a paying guest of anything, based on where his eyes are pointed. But I made a note in the log, because that's what the log is for. He came back a 3rd time on day 4. Different pretext again. A noise complaint this time. Said he heard shouting in the hallway at 2 in the morning and wanted to see if anyone else was disturbed. I checked. There was no shouting. There was, however, a woman in a housekeeping uniform exiting that same crew door at 1:52 a.m. and walking to the elevator. He'd asked for footage covering exactly her 10-minute window, 3 separate times. 3 separate excuses, and every single request centered on the same 6 feet of hallway. That's when I stopped treating it as a coincidence and started treating it as a pattern. I pulled the manifest and cross-referenced the crew door. It belonged to a supervisor named Priya, housekeeping, Deck 7 and 8. I checked her schedule against his 3 requests. Every window he'd asked for lined up with her shift change, down to the minute. A guest doesn't guess a crew member's shift schedule by accident. He'd been tracking it before he ever set foot in my office. I went further. I pulled his booking record, and this is where it stopped feeling like an odd guest and started feeling like something I needed to take upstairs. He'd booked the cruise 9 days before departure. Last-minute bookings aren't rare. People do it for anniversaries, for last-second deals. But what caught me was the fare class. He'd paid full price for a mid-tier balcony room when 3 cheaper interior cabins were available on the same deck. He didn't pick a room, he picked a hallway. I went to find Priya directly, told myself I was just doing a routine welfare check, the kind we do when a guest's behavior gets flagged near crew areas. I asked if she recognized a passenger by the name on his booking. She said no, but her hands were folded a little too tightly on the laundry cart handle when she said it. And she didn't ask why I was asking, which almost everyone does. People who have nothing to hide want the whole story. She just wanted the conversation to end. I let it go for the moment, because I still didn't have anything you could act on. A man watching hallway footage isn't a crime. A crew member who seems nervous isn't evidence. So I did what any of us would do. I dug into his name a little harder, and that's where the floor tilted under me. The booking name didn't match the name on his passport scan from embarkation. Not fraud. Nothing that dramatic. It turned out to be a legal name change, filed 2 years earlier, in a different state than his listed residence. People change their names for a lot of ordinary reasons. Marriage, divorce, distancing from a father they hated. But when I searched the old name against our internal incident database, shared across the fleet for exactly this kind of situation, it came back with a flag from a sister ship 18 months prior. A guest removed from a Mediterranean sailing for repeated unwanted contact with a crew member. No charges filed, just quietly disembarked at the next port and never rebooked under that name again. Until now, apparently, under a new one. I brought him in for a conversation the next morning, framed casually, said we were doing routine follow-up on the noise complaint. He sat across from me in the security office looking completely unbothered, hands folded, posture relaxed in a way that should have been reassuring, and instead made my skin crawl a little, because guests who are actually confused or innocent tend to fidget. He didn't. I asked him plainly why he kept requesting footage of that particular stretch of hallway. He smiled and said he liked routines, liked knowing the ship's rhythms. Then he said something that I still think about. He mentioned, unprompted, that Priya liked to have her coffee black with 2 sugars before her afternoon shift. I hadn't said her name. I hadn't given him any name at all. That's the moment this stopped being a judgment call and became a protocol situation. I walked straight to my supervisor, and we pulled 3 days of raw footage ourselves. Not the clips he'd requested, but everything. Wide angle, unfiltered. And there it was, sitting in plain sight the whole time, because nobody had ever had a reason to look for it. Him, at 6 a.m., on day 3, standing outside the crew door for 4 full minutes before slipping something underneath it and walking away like nothing had happened. We pulled the item. Housekeeping found it before we did. A folded piece of hotel stationery, no envelope, just her first name written on the outside, in handwriting too neat to be casual. Priya wouldn't open it in front of us. She asked to be alone for a minute, and when she came back out, her face had the particular stillness of someone who'd just had a fear confirmed, rather than a fear introduced. She finally told us the truth, sitting in that office, and it rearranged everything I thought I understood about the situation. They'd known each other 2 years earlier, on land, before either of them worked at sea. A relationship, briefly, that ended badly enough that she'd filed a restraining order against him in her home state. She'd taken the job with the cruise line specifically because it put an ocean and a legal jurisdiction between them, because ships move, because he couldn't just show up outside her apartment anymore. She hadn't told anyone on board, because she was ashamed of it, and because for 2 years it had actually worked. We locked down the situation the way protocol demands, restricted his keycard access to guest-only zones, posted additional coverage on that corridor, and radioed ahead to the next port, which happened to be a U.S. territory, meaning actual law enforcement could board and take a report the moment we docked. I want to say it ended there, clean and procedural, but it didn't, because that night, hours before we were due to dock, he tried the crew door himself, not with a stolen keycard. He'd apparently spent the week watching housekeeping staff badge in and out enough times to memorize the entry code on the backup keypad, the one crew use when badges fail. He got the door open. He didn't get further than the service stairwell before 2 of us caught up to him, because we'd been watching that door as hard as he had. He didn't fight. That was almost the worst part. He just sat down on the stairs and started talking, fast and quiet, about how he only wanted to explain himself, how the restraining order was a misunderstanding, how he'd been diagnosed with something terminal 8 months earlier, and just wanted to see her face one more time before he ran out of time to see anyone's face at all. I don't know if that part was true. We never confirmed it, and it doesn't change what he did or what would have happened if he'd made it through that door instead of us. But it stayed with me that a person can be dangerous and grieving in the same breath, that the two things don't cancel each other out, they just make the danger harder to see coming. We held him in a designated cabin, guarded, until we docked the next morning. Local police boarded within the hour. Priya gave her statement, calm and clear, the way people are when they've been rehearsing that exact conversation in their head for 2 years, without ever getting to have it. He was taken off the ship in restraints, quietly, before most of the passengers were even awake for breakfast. The restraining order got refiled that same day with the new jurisdiction attached, and the cruise line flagged both his names permanently across every ship in the fleet. Priya put in her transfer request within the week, moved to a different route entirely, one that never crosses this one. I still run this same rotation, still sit in that same office, and I still pull footage for guests who swear a cart clipped their ankle. Most of the time, that's exactly what happened. But I watch the eyes now, not just the request. Where a person looks tells you more than what they ask you to find. Thomas Reyes had been on the Kestrel Bay for 4 months when the bosun pulled him aside during the evening muster and told him he'd be taking over night rounds on Deck 2, aft. Ernesto Cabrera, the regular after his hitch, had gone home early on a family emergency, or that's what the paperwork said, and someone had to walk the cargo deck between midnight and 4, while the rest of the ship slept through the Pacific crossing. Thomas said sure, no problem. More overtime pay never hurt anybody. The bosun, a heavy-set man named Delgado, who didn't usually pause before handing out assignments, paused. Just a half second, maybe less, before he said, "Keep your radio on you the whole time," and walked off toward the bridge. Thomas didn't think much of it that first night. He should have. Deck 2 aft wasn't like the rest of the ship. It sat below the main cargo stacks, a long steel corridor lined with container lashings that hadn't held a container in over a year, ever since the company shifted this route away from carrying vehicles. Now it was just empty rails, coiled mooring line, spare bollards, and sodium lights spaced too far apart, throwing more shadow than light. His job was simple. Walk the length of it. Check the lashings hadn't worked loose in the swell. Check for water intrusion near the shell plating. Radio in every 30 minutes. 40 minutes there and back, if he didn't dawdle. Most of the ship at that hour was full of noise, even when it was quiet. The kind of ambient hum a man stops registering after his first week aboard. Generators and pumps, and the distant clang of something loose in a stairwell 3 decks up. Deck 2 aft didn't have that. It had the engine hum, muffled and far off, and then nothing else. A stretch of dead air that made his own breathing sound loud in his ears. He liked it at first. Some men can't stand the quiet, but Tomas had grown up the youngest of 6 in a 2-bedroom house, and a stretch of nobody talking to him felt closer to a vacation than a chore. The first 2 nights were boring, in the particular way that makes a person grateful for boredom. He walked, he checked boxes on a clipboard, he listened to the hum of the engine 3 decks down, and the slow groan of the hull working against the swell. On the 3rd night, somewhere around 1 in the morning, he noticed his own footsteps sounded wrong. Not wrong exactly. Doubled, like a cheap microphone picking up its own echo a beat too late. He stopped walking to listen closer, and in the half-second before the sound caught up with the silence, he heard one more footstep land behind him that wasn't his. He turned his flashlight down the corridor. Empty rails, empty shadows, the usual mess of coiled lines stacked against the bulkhead. Nothing moving, he told himself. It was the hull. Ship's talk. Everybody who's spent time at sea knows that. Steel expands and contracts with the temperature difference between the water outside and the air inside, and on an old boat like this one, that groaning can sound like almost anything if you're tired enough and alone enough. He picked up his pace anyway, finished the round faster than usual, and didn't mention it on his radio check. The 4th night he mentioned it. He called it in as routine, casual. "Hey, is there maintenance running down here?" Hearing some noise on Deck 2, and the response from the bridge crackled back that no, nobody was scheduled down there. Why? He said never mind, probably rats. The voice on the other end, A third mate named Alvarez, who Tomas had shared exactly 4 conversations with in 4 months, said something that stuck with him longer than it should have. Yeah, Cabrera said the same thing about rats. Just log it and keep moving. Cabrera, the guy Tomas was covering for. The guy who'd apparently mentioned something before he suddenly needed to go home. He didn't sleep well that day. He asked around, casual, not wanting to seem like the new guy losing his nerve 4 months in. One of the older ABs, a Filipino man named Bert, who'd been sailing this route for 11 years, told him over coffee that Deck 2 aft used to run rounds every hour, not every 30 minutes, and that got changed about 8 months back, after 2 different guys asked off the assignment inside the same month. Bert didn't know why, or he did know why and didn't want to say. Tomas couldn't tell which, and Bert changed the subject fast enough that Tomas didn't push. 5th night, he found something. Halfway down the corridor, on a stretch of deck plating that should have been bone dry, there was a smear of water tracking between 2 lashing points. Not a puddle, a trail, like something wet had walked through and kept walking. He crouched down with his flashlight and followed it about 15 feet before it just stopped. No splash pattern, no drip line leading off toward a scupper or a hatch. It started at nothing and ended at nothing. His own boots were dry. He'd checked the weather log before coming down. No spray had come over that high. No rain in 6 days. He wrote it up as a possible leak from the fire main and moved on, because writing anything else down felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. The 6th night. The sound stopped trailing him and started leading him. He noticed it first as a change in rhythm, the extra footstep no longer landing a half beat after his own, but arriving just before it, like something up ahead was stepping into a spot he hadn't reached yet. He stood dead still in the middle of the corridor for almost a full minute, listening so hard his ears started producing their own static, and the sound had stopped too, exactly when he stopped, exactly where he was. That was the night the lights on the port side, 4 fixtures in a row, went dark all at once, no flicker, no warning, just gone, and the breaker for that circuit was fine when he checked it the next afternoon. He walked that dark stretch with his flashlight as his only light, and for about 20 feet, his own footsteps stopped echoing wrong and started echoing exact, perfectly matched, timed to the millisecond, like his shadow had learned to walk, which should have been a relief. 1 less second of that half-beat lag that had been chewing at him for 3 nights, except it wasn't a relief at all, because underneath the sound of his own boots, he could hear breathing that wasn't timed to his, wasn't matched to anything, just there, close enough that he felt it more than heard it. He didn't run. He wanted to say that later, that he didn't run, that he kept his pace steady, and finished the round like a professional. And mostly that was true, except for the last 40 feet, which he covered faster than a ship's deck really allows a man to move without falling. The 7th night he found his own gear disturbed. He'd left his spare flashlight clipped to a lashing rail near the halfway mark, standard practice. A backup in case the primary died. When he reached it, it wasn't clipped anymore. It was sitting upright on the deck, balanced on its base like someone had set it down deliberately, pointed straight down the corridor toward where he'd be walking from. He hadn't left it that way. He was certain he hadn't left it that way, the same way he was certain of his own name, and that certainty scared him more than the footsteps had, because footsteps could be explained by tired ears and a groaning hull, but a flashlight doesn't stand itself up and aim itself at a hallway. He almost called it in right there. He got as far as keying the radio before he stopped himself, because he could already hear how it would sound, and he didn't want to be the second guy this month who asked off Deck 2 over nothing he could actually show anybody. The 8th night was the last one he did alone. He was 3/4 through the round, coming up on the narrow stretch where the corridor necked down between 2 rows of stacked bollards, when the footsteps behind him stopped being a rhythm and became a presence, close, closer than sound should carry in open air, close enough that the hair on his arms stood up before his brain caught up to why. He turned into the gap between the bollard stacks without meaning to, some animal part of him choosing a corner to put his back against rather than an open hallway, and the footsteps stopped exactly when his did, right in front of him, maybe 6 feet out, maybe less. He stood there with his flashlight down at his side, not raising it, because some part of him understood that as long as he didn't look, whatever this was hadn't fully arrived yet, and the second he raised that light, it would be real in a way he couldn't take back. The air in the gap between the bollards had gone colder than the rest of the corridor, a pocket of it, the way a walk-in freezer feels for the first second after the door opens, and underneath that cold there was a smell he couldn't place, something like wet rope and rusted metal and, faintly, the copper smell of blood. He stood there for 11 seconds. He counted them later, replaying it. 11 seconds of something breathing in the dark 6 feet from his face, while the ship groaned around them both. And somewhere in those 11 seconds, he became convinced, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that it was looking directly at him. Then he raised the light. Nothing. Empty corridor. Empty rails. The usual coils of rope, stacked exactly where they'd been stacked for a year. No shape retreating into shadow. No sound of anything moving away. No explanation of any kind. Just Tomas, alone, breathing hard, in a hallway that had been holding its breath the same as he was, 90 seconds ago. He finished the round because his legs moved, before his mind gave permission, and he called it in from the top of the ladder well, with his voice flatter than he meant it to sound. On his way back to his bunk, he passed the spot again, and near the base of the last bollard stack, in a thin skin of dust that collected on that deck between cleanings, there was a single handprint. Not his. Too wide across the palm, fingers spaced wrong for a man his size, pressed into the dust at a height that put it just above where his own shoulder would sit if he'd been standing there. No trail leading to it. No trail leading away. He requested a transfer off Deck 2 aft the next morning, standing in Delgado's doorway with his hands jammed in his pockets so the bosun wouldn't see them shaking. He didn't have a good explanation ready. Figured he'd have to fight for it, maybe get laughed at in front of the other ABs at breakfast. Delgado didn't argue. Didn't even ask why. He just looked at Tomas for a second too long. The same kind of pause he'd given before the assignment 8 nights earlier, then crossed his name off the list and wrote in Bert's instead, the way you'd expect a man to do this the 3rd time in a year. Bert did 2 nights before he asked off 2. He never said what he saw or heard, and Tomas never asked, because by then, he understood that some things get worse the more people compare notes on them, and some things you're better off carrying alone. They run that deck in daylight only now, 2 men at a time, nobody alone, nobody after dark, and if you ask any of them why, they'll tell you rats, or hull expansion, or an old ship settling into an old hull, and they'll say it fast, the way people say things they've decided not to think about too hard. Tomas still ships out on cargo runs. He's fine most nights, but every so often, walking some other empty corridor on some other quiet ship, he'll catch his own footsteps landing half a beat behind where they should, and he doesn't stop to listen anymore. He just walks faster, and he doesn't look back, and he never, ever takes that duty alone. The first time I saw Walter Combs order 2 drinks, I figured he was just missing somebody who'd stood him up, and that by midnight, he'd give up and drink them both himself. That was 4 years ago, my 2nd week behind the bar at the Anchor Room, and I didn't know yet that I'd be wrong about almost everything that followed. He came in every night at 20 to midnight, wearing an overcoat that made him look older than his 70-some years, and he always sat on the same stool at the far end, the one closest to the window looking out over the parking lot toward the dark line of the river. He'd order 2 old fashions, drink his slow, and set the other across from him like somebody was sitting there. At 1:15 midnight, he'd pay for both, leave the 2nd glass full and untouched, and walk out without another word. I thought it was sweet, in a sad sort of way. Bartenders see a lot of grief dressed up as habit. I figured he'd lost a wife, and pouring out a drink was his way of saying, I still think about you. I didn't ask questions. You learn not to in this job. But 4 years is a long time to watch a man talk to an empty stool, and eventually, the not asking started to feel like its own kind of rudeness. So one night, maybe 8 months in, I set his drink down and asked, casual as I could make it, who's the second one for tonight? Walt. He looked up at me, And something moved behind his eyes that hadn't been there a second before. Not annoyance. Something closer to relief, like he'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask. "She's just running late," he said. Flat. Even. The exact same 5 words I'd hear him say every time I asked after that. Word for word. For years. Like a line from a play he'd performed 1,000 times and stopped putting feeling into. That's when the charm of it started to curdle a little, right at the edges. A habit is one thing. A rehearsed answer is another. I brought it up to Marion, who'd owned the place since it was a tackle shop with a liquor license bolted onto the side, and she poured herself a coffee before she answered me, which is how I knew it was going to be a long one. She told me Walt had been doing this every single night, not some nights, not anniversaries, every night, since before she bought the building in 1994. 3 renovations, 2 name changes, 1 flood that closed the place for a summer, and through all of it he'd shown up at 20 to midnight and ordered 2 drinks. 30-some years, she said, like she still couldn't quite believe she was saying it out loud. I'd been picturing a man honoring a memory once a year. What she described was something closer to a man who had simply never left the night it happened. The story came out of her slow, like she'd told it so few times the words had gone stiff from disuse. Walt had been engaged to a woman named Eleanor, and the week before their wedding, they'd planned to meet at the bar for a toast, just the 2 of them, before the families descended. Eleanor never showed. Her car went off the road near the Averill Bridge in a storm that night, and by the time anyone found the car, the door was open, and the river had already done what rivers do. Walt kept coming back anyway. Marion said he told her once, years ago, that leaving the seat empty felt worse than the alternative, whatever the alternative was supposed to be. I couldn't leave it alone after that, so on a slow afternoon, I pulled up the old papers archive at the library and found the article myself, half expecting it to match exactly what Marion had told me. Mostly it did, but one detail sat wrong. The article said the car was recovered, empty, door open, no body, and that Eleanor Voss was listed as missing, presumed drowned, and was only legally declared dead 7 years later, because state law required it. Presumed. Not confirmed. Not found. I read that word 4 or 5 times, sitting there in the library with the paper's brittle photocopy in front of me, and something in my chest went quiet and cold in a way I didn't have a name for yet. Around that same stretch of weeks, small things started happening at the bar that I couldn't quite explain away, though God knows I tried. The second glass, the one Walt never touched, would sometimes be a little lower than it should have been by the time I cleared it, like somebody had taken a sip when my back was turned. There'd be a ring of condensation on the bar in front of that stool some nights, even when the glass hadn't sweated yet. And once, closing up, I found the cushion on that stool pressed down in a shape that didn't match how empty stools usually sit. I told myself it was the dishwasher, the heating vents, my own tired eyes at 1 in the morning. I mostly believed myself. Mostly. Somewhere in there, I noticed I'd started guarding that stool, the way you guard something that actually matters to you. When the bar got busy on a Friday, and some group of 20-somethings tried to pull it over to their table, I told them it was reserved, in a tone that surprised even me. I started keeping it clean during the dinner rush, just in case Walt came early. I didn't examine too closely why I cared. I just did. That instinct got tested hard when Marion sold the building the following spring. The new owners wanted to gut the place, sports bar theme, big screens, no fixed seating, everything on casters so it could be rearranged for game nights. I fought for that one stool harder than I fought for my own job security, telling the new manager some story about a longtime regular with a bad hip who needed a specific seat near the window. It was half true. He let it stay, mostly because it was easier than arguing with me, and I remember feeling a strange, disproportionate relief, like I'd protected something more fragile than furniture. It was around then that Walt, for the only time in 4 years, told me more than 5 words about her. It was a dead Tuesday, nobody else in the place, and he was 2 drinks past his usual limit for himself. He said the last thing he ever said to Eleanor was cruel, something about her sister, something he'd been ashamed of every day since, and that she'd driven off angry into that storm because of him, not toward him. He said the worst part wasn't losing her. The worst part was that the last thing she ever heard from him was something he didn't mean. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have sounded small next to that. Not long after, I started noticing him thinning out, the overcoat hanging looser on him, a cough that hung around past the changing seasons, a cane he hadn't needed before. He mentioned a doctor's appointment once, offhand, the way people mention things they've decided not to make a big deal of. I didn't push, but I started watching him the way you watch someone you're afraid of losing, cataloging him a little each night, like I was trying to memorize something before it left. Then, on an ordinary Thursday in October, nothing special about the weather, no storm, no anniversary that I knew of, Walt sat down and ordered his 2 drinks, and said something he'd never said before. He said, "I think tonight might be the night." He said it the way you'd mention rain coming, not fear, not hope exactly, just a kind of tired certainty. I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head and told me to keep pouring. At 11:47, the door opened, and a woman walked in alone, silver-haired, coat too light for October, moving like she'd walked further than the parking lot could account for. I knew her face before I could have explained how. Marion had shown me a photograph once, from a drawer behind the register, Walt and a younger woman laughing at some barbecue decades ago. And this woman's face carried that same face, the way a river carries the shape of the land it used to cut through. She walked straight to the far stool, the one that had never once in 4 years had anyone else sit in it, and she sat down across from Walt, like she'd only stepped out for a moment. I don't know what they said to each other. I kept myself busy at the register, glancing over only in pieces, the two of them leaning close, her hand eventually resting over his on the bar, Walt's face doing something I'd never seen it do before, something that looked almost like the absence of 30 years of weight all at once. I picked up a rack of glasses, turned my back for maybe 90 seconds, and when I turned around again, the stools were both empty, pushed in neat, both glasses drained dry, and neither one of them anywhere in the room, or the parking lot, or the road beyond it. Walt never came back after that night. 9 days later, I saw his name in the obituaries, dead in his armchair at home, and the notice mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been under hospice care for a lung condition for the past several months, which meant he'd been dying, slowly and knowingly, through every single one of those last visits. Nobody could tell me anything about a woman matching Eleanor's description, no name in any system, no trace of her ever having been in that town at all that week. I still work the same bar. Some nights, when it's slow and it gets close to 20 to midnight, I pour 2 old fashions anyway, out of habit or respect, or something I've stopped trying to name, and I set the second one down across from the empty stool by the window, and I leave it there until closing, untouched, the way he always did. Mara Delgado had the graveyard shift stitched into her badge twice over that night. Night auditor down in the front office, and relief officer of the watch up on the bridge, because 3rd Officer Halverson had spent the last 6 hours hugging a toilet bowl with food poisoning, and somebody with a valid watchkeeping certificate had to stand in his slot until the company could arrange a relief at the next port. She'd done the cadet years before she ever balanced a night audit ledger, and the company liked having a body who could do both, even if it meant she was running on coffee and adrenaline by 3 in the morning. The sea was flat calm, black glass under a half moon, autopilot holding course, radar clean except for a fishing fleet 40 miles off the beam. She had the night orders open on the chart table, the log filled in every hour on the hour, and for a solid stretch of the middle watch, nothing to do but listen to the hum of the electronics and the occasional creak of the hull settling into a swell. It was the kind of quiet that made a person's eyelids heavy, the kind she'd been trained to distrust, because nothing on a ship stays quiet forever. At 0347, the general alarm on the bridge panel went off. Not the ship's regular bells, but the sharp, specific tone reserved for one thing only, followed by the automated address system booming through every corridor and cabin. Man overboard, all hands to muster stations. Her first reaction wasn't fear, it was confusion, because there was no drill scheduled that night, none logged in the night orders, nothing in the master's standing instructions, and drills were never sprung at 3:45 in the morning without written notice to the bridge first. Her second reaction, the one she almost acted on, was to assume the automatic detection system had thrown another false positive. The camera array that scanned the wake for anything that didn't belong there had cried wolf twice already that crossing, once for a chunk of floating pallet, and once for a pod of dolphins breaking the surface at the wrong angle. Her hand actually hovered over the acknowledge button, the one that would silence the klaxon and log it as a sensor fault pending review, because that was the boring, statistically likely explanation, and boring was what 4 in the morning was supposed to be. Then she pulled up the camera feed, instead of trusting her gut, because protocol said visual confirmation before anything gets canceled, and what she saw on the grainy aft deck monitor stopped the air in her chest. A shape came off the port side railing, arms out, and hit the wake in a splash that the camera's night vision turned white for half a second before the water swallowed it whole. Not a pallet, not a dolphin, a person. She hit the direct line to the captain's cabin so hard the receiver nearly cracked, and inside 90 seconds Captain Ruiz was on the bridge in a t-shirt and pajama pants, hair still flat from the pillow, giving orders before he'd finished reading the radar. He called for a Williamson turn, and Mara watched him run the maneuver herself for the first time outside a simulator. Hard over, hold the turn until the heading swung 60 degrees off the original course, then reverse the rudder to bring the ship back down her own wake to the exact point where the man had gone in. On paper, it takes minutes. In the water in the dark, it feels like the ship is dragging its feet through wet sand, every second stretching, while somewhere behind them, a stranger is treading black water, with no idea if anyone even knows he's out there. Down below, the muster call was doing what muster calls do to a ship full of sleeping people, tearing it apart at the seams. Passengers stumbled into hallways in bathrobes and confused half-sentences. Crew ran cabin-by-cabin lists with flashlights. Stewards banged on doors that didn't answer fast enough, and the muster stations filled with a rising, uneven noise, somewhere between panic and irritation, because nobody had told them yet whether this was real. It took 11 minutes to get a headcount discrepancy, which on a ship carrying 1,200 souls is actually fast, and the name that came back empty was Julian Osei, cabin 7114, traveling with a college roommate 2 decks down from where he was supposed to be sleeping. Mara knew the name before security even read it out loud, because she'd checked him in at the front desk herself around midnight. A laundry billing dispute. Nothing important, except she remembered him leaning on the counter a beat too long afterward and saying, half joking, that the ocean out here looked like it went on forever, like nothing that happened on it would ever matter to anybody. She'd laughed it off at the time. She was not laughing now. Security pulled the corridor and aft deck footage while the ship was still coming around on her turn, and the first pass looked exactly like what everyone in the room feared. One figure alone at the railing, climbing, going over. But somebody rewound it 8 minutes further back, and there were 2 figures out there, not one, standing close, talking, and then not talking. The second man's face turned away from the camera and stayed that way, and 3 minutes later he was gone from frame entirely, moving fast toward a stairwell, alone, away from the railing where Julian was still standing when the recording cut to the moment he went over. That single detail flipped the entire tone on the bridge. This wasn't a man who'd wandered out to the rail by himself in the middle of the night. Somebody had been with him. Somebody had walked away right before it happened and hadn't raised the alarm. The automatic sensor had done that on its own, 30 seconds after the water closed over him, and whoever that second figure was hadn't said a word to anyone. The rescue boat crew scrambled the fast rescue craft the second the ship steadied on her reciprocal heading, and spotlights from both bridge wings raked the water in overlapping arcs, while the ship crawled at dead slow toward the GPS mark. The system had logged automatically the instant the alarm tripped. 15 minutes in, someone on the port wing shouted that they had something, an orange flash, low in the swell dead ahead, and for one bright second, the whole bridge exhaled at once. It wasn't Julian. It was the self-inflating marker buoy, The one the overboard system drops automatically at the point of detection, bobbing exactly where it was built to bob, a beacon and nothing more. The disappointment lasted about 4 seconds before Ruiz turned it into the only piece of good news they had. A fixed, GPS-accurate point to search around, instead of a guess, based on current and drift, and how long ago the alarm had actually gone off. While the rescue craft widened its search pattern around the marker, security found the roommate, Devon, 20 years old, gray in the face, sitting on the floor of the stairwell, landing where the cameras had lost him, not hiding exactly, just frozen. What came out of him in pieces over the next few minutes wasn't a confession to anything violent. It was worse in its own smaller way. The two of them had been drinking since the casino closed, roughhousing the way drunk friends do, at a railing they had no business leaning on, shoving each other back and forth, as a joke that had worked a dozen times before on dry land and had never once mattered, until the ship rolled 2 degrees on a swell at the exact wrong moment. And Julian went over the top rail instead of catching himself against it like always, and Devon stood there long enough to watch it happen and not long enough to do anything about it before his legs took him running, not toward help, just away. Some animal panic override. He'd spend the rest of the trip, and probably years after trying to explain to himself. 40 minutes had passed since the splash on the camera by the time the rescue craft's spotlight caught something pale rolling in the chop, 200 meters off the marker buoy, drifting with the same current the buoy had been fighting the whole time. The water that night was 61 degrees, cold enough that survival times get measured in a narrow window doctors don't like to say out loud to families, and the radio traffic on the bridge had gone quiet in the specific way it does when everyone is doing the math and nobody wants to say it first. He was face up when they reached him, which the crew would later say probably saved his life vest, the automatic kind that inflates on water contact, holding his head clear of the swell, even though he was long past being able to keep himself there on his own. He wasn't moving. He wasn't answering. But when the rescue swimmer got a hand on his jaw and checked for breath, there was breath, shallow and slow and cold, but there, and the shout that went up from the boat to the bridge was the first sound all night that made Mara's knees actually go weak, with relief instead of dread. They had him aboard and into the medical bay within 7 minutes, core temperature so low the doctor wouldn't give odds out loud, wrapped in warming blankets, with an IV running heated fluid, and it was another 2 hours before anyone was willing to say the word stable instead of critical. He made it! Devon sat outside the medical bay door the entire 2 hours and didn't move either, and nobody had the heart yet to tell him what came next for a story like that. The questions from the company, the report Mara herself would have to help write for the Flag State investigators, the version of events that would follow both of those young men long after the ship made port. Mara finished her watch at 8 that morning with her hands still not quite steady, looking out at a sea gone flat and gold under an ordinary sunrise, the kind that gives no hint at all of what it swallowed a few hours earlier. 9 minutes, the rescue chief told her later, unprompted, like he needed to say it to someone. If that marker buoy hadn't held its position, if the current had run a little harder, if the vest hadn't fired, 9 minutes either direction, and they'd have been pulling a different kind of report out of the water. She wrote up the night order log entry in a hand that barely looked like her own, and under cause of alarm, after everything, all she could bring herself to write was one line. Real. I was closing out the front desk when the call came in, 11:40 at night, 20 minutes before I was supposed to clock out and go home to a cold dinner and a hot shower. The guest didn't want the spa suite downstairs. She wanted the massage brought up to her room, 8214, and she wanted it now, tonight, not tomorrow morning, like every reasonable person books a treatment. My manager shrugged and said take it. She already paid for 90 minutes and tipped the front desk $200 just to make the ask happen. That kind of money doesn't come from someone who's thinking clearly about a Tuesday night massage, but I didn't think about that until much later. I grabbed my table, my oils, my playlist, and I told myself this was just a tired traveler who couldn't sleep. The room was on the top floor, at the end of a hallway that had gone quiet the way hotel hallways do after midnight, carpet swallowing every sound except my own wheels squeaking. I knocked, said housekeeping's evening turn-down line out of habit, then corrected myself and said spa services. Nobody answered. The door was unlocked, propped with the little metal latch flipped so it wouldn't close behind her, which struck me as strange even then, because most guests make you knock twice and check the peephole first. I pushed it open, and the room was warm, warmer than a hotel room should be, and dark except for one lamp turned to the wall. She was already on the bed, face down, sheet pulled up to her shoulders, exactly the way I position clients myself. She had set herself up before I even arrived. I said hello the way I always do, told her my name was Mara, asked how her day had been, all the small, ordinary things that get a client's nervous system to settle before my hands ever touch them. She said her day had been long and getting longer, and then, without me asking anything else, she said, "You're going to be the last hands that touch me today." I laughed a little, the polite laugh you give when you're not sure if something's a joke, and told her I'd try to make it count. She didn't laugh back. I started on her shoulders, standard deep tissue, and that's when I saw it, the inside of her left elbow, a bruise the size of a thumbprint, yellow-green at the edges like it was a few days old, and next to it a fresher one, still purple, with a tiny raised dot at the center. Not a bug bite, not the kind of bruise you get bumping into a door frame. I've seen enough IV bruising working near the medical spa downstairs to know what a needle site looks like, and this looked exactly like that, except it wasn't lined up like someone drawing blood at a clinic. It looked like someone doing it themselves, in a hurry, in a bathroom mirror. I kept working, and kept my voice light, and asked if she was in town for work or pleasure, and she said neither. She was in town to finish something. I asked what that meant, and she went quiet for a while, long enough that I thought she'd drifted off, and then she said, very calmly, that she used to leave her body all the time when she was a kid, that she got hit by a car when she was 9, and floated up near the ceiling of the ambulance and watched 2 paramedics working on a little girl who turned out to be her. She said it the way you'd describe a memory of a birthday party. No fear in it at all, just fact. I told her that sounded like a really hard thing to go through, and she said it wasn't hard. It was the easiest thing that ever happened to her, because for the first time in her life nothing hurt. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, her language shifted, and I noticed it because it's the kind of thing you catch with your hands before your brain catches up. She said we've been getting ready for tonight for a long time. Not I've been getting ready. We. I asked who she meant by we, thinking maybe she had a partner traveling with her, someone in the bathroom, and she said, still face down, still totally relaxed under my hands, "Don't worry about them. They're not going to bother you." My stomach did something I didn't have a word for yet. I told her I needed to step out for 1 second to grab a warmer blanket, which wasn't true, and I walked straight to the elevator, with my heart going harder than the walk should have caused. Downstairs at the desk, I asked the night clerk to pull up the guest profile for 8214, and she gave me a look, because that's not really something we do, but she typed it in anyway. Diane Whitfield. Checked in alone. No second guest registered. No emergency contact on file. And a note flagged from a stay 8 months earlier that just said, in the dry language hotel systems use, guest declined to provide emergency contact per policy. Guest requested therapy services be conducted in room. Front desk to notify manager if repeated. Nobody had followed up on that note. It had just sat there in the system for 8 months, waiting for someone to read it at the right moment, and I was apparently that someone. I went back up because I didn't know what else to do, and because some part of me still wanted to believe I was overreacting to a lonely woman with a sad childhood story. When I walked back in, something had changed in the 2 minutes I'd been gone. Her breathing had slowed, really slowed, the kind of slow you notice because you spend your whole career with your hands on people's rib cages, feeling them rise and fall. I put my palm flat on her back the way I do to check in, and it was cooler than it had been 40 minutes earlier, and clammy in a way that had nothing to do with the massage oil. I asked her, as gently as I could, if she'd taken anything before I got there, medication, a sleep aid, anything, just so I could make sure I wasn't pressing too hard anywhere. She said she'd taken enough to go, and she said it the same calm way she'd said everything else. No drama in her voice, like she was telling me she'd already eaten dinner. I looked over at the nightstand, and there was a folded robe sitting on top of something, and when I lifted the corner of it, there were 3 empty prescription bottles lined up neat as soldiers, lids off, sitting next to a half-empty glass of water. I hadn't seen them when I set up, because they'd been under that robe the entire time, right there, while I was rubbing lavender oil into her shoulders and asking about her day. She must have felt me go still, because she turned her head on the face cradle just enough to look at me sideways, and she said, "Please, just finish. I wanted this to be the last thing I felt, something that felt good, before I felt nothing." There was no anger in it. If anything, there was a kind of gratitude, like she was thanking me in advance, and that was somehow worse than if she'd been crying or screaming, because it meant she had planned this down to the hour, down to booking a massage therapist to give her 1 gentle hour before whatever she'd swallowed finished its work. I did not finish the massage. I kept my hand on her back, kept talking to her in the same even voice I'd been using the whole time, told her about nothing in particular, my drive to work, the weather, anything to keep her listening to a human voice, while I reached my other hand behind me for the room phone on the nightstand and dialed the front desk without looking at the buttons, because I've dialed that extension 1,000 times. I told them I needed security and paramedics to A214 right now, and I said it low and steady so it wouldn't sound like a scream, because some instinct told me a scream would be the thing that made her stop talking to me, and as long as she was talking to me, she was still awake. Those 8 minutes waiting for the door to open were the longest 8 minutes I've spent anywhere. I kept one hand between her shoulder blades the entire time, partly to keep her calm, and partly, I think now, to keep myself anchored to something solid, because the room had started to feel like it was tilting, even though nothing in it had moved. When the paramedics finally came through the door, she was still conscious, barely, her eyes half open, and one of them told me afterward, out in the hallway while I sat on the carpet with my back against the wall because my legs had stopped being reliable, that getting to her before she lost consciousness was the difference that mattered most. She survived. I found that out 3 weeks later, not from the hotel, but from a folded note left at the front desk, addressed to me by name, no return address, just 5 lines in handwriting that leaned hard to the left. She thanked me for the massage. She said she picked that hotel, that room, because it was the room her daughter had died in 4 years earlier, alone, from an overdose nobody caught in time, and she'd wanted to go the same way, in the same place, and instead, a stranger's hands had kept her tethered to the one thing her daughter never got, which was somebody noticing in time. I still work the late shift. I still take last-minute bookings when they come in. But now, I check the inside of every elbow before I start, without making it obvious, running my thumbs along that soft skin like it's just part of the warm-up. And some nights, after the room is empty and the elevator doors close behind me, I catch myself holding my own wrist and pressing 2 fingers against it, just to feel my own pulse still going, just to be sure the last hour actually ended the way I think it did. I worked nights on the Areto Sentinel, a container ship hauling refrigerated cargo between Long Beach and Yokohama, 3-week rotations with a 6-person galley crew and a walk-in freezer the size of a 1-car garage, bolted into the aft section below the mess deck. My job was prep. Get the eggs cracked, the bread proofed, the fish portioned, before the day crew came stumbling in at 5 in the morning. Nobody else was really around at 2 a.m., except the 2 guys standing watch on the bridge, and you never saw them, unless something had gone wrong enough to need a cook. The smell started my 2nd week out. Not rot. I know rot. I've worked enough kitchens to smell a bad piece of chicken from across a walk-in with the door shut. This was sweeter, with a metallic edge under it, like a battery that sat too long in a junk drawer, mixed with something almost like the inside of a new car. It came and went. I'd walk in for the milk crates, catch 4 or 5 seconds of it, and then it would be gone, like somebody had opened a window somewhere I couldn't see and shut it just as fast. I mentioned it to Danny, the second cook, over coffee before the sun came up. He laughed it off. Said a rat probably got into the compressor housing and died in there. Happens on every ship eventually. Nothing worth losing sleep over. Ortiz, the chief cook, said basically the same thing without even looking up from his clipboard. Dead rat, ductwork, don't worry about it. That should have settled it for me. Except I've smelled a dead rat in a wall before, back at a diner job in Fresno, and it doesn't come and go like a scent does. It sits there. It gets worse by the day. This wasn't getting worse. It was visiting on a schedule, like it had somewhere else to be. So I started paying attention to when exactly it showed up, and I noticed something. It always came around 2:40, 2:45, right after I heard the walk-in door open and reseal down the corridor. Even on nights I hadn't gone in myself, and nobody else had any prep reason to. We kept a sign-in sheet clipped to the door frame, the kind you're supposed to initial every single time you go in for a cargo count. Insurance requirement, standard stuff. 3 nights running, I could hear that door get used. The seal has a specific sound, a soft thump and a hiss. And 3 nights running, there were no new initials on the sheet. That got me curious enough to pull the temperature printout straight off the unit, the one nobody ever actually reads, because it just spits out a strip every 12 hours for the chief engineer to file away. 2 nights back, the internal temperature had spiked 9 degrees and held there for almost 2 hours in the dead of night, then dropped back to spec like nothing had happened. 9 degrees, in a room that size, doesn't happen because somebody grabbed a jug of milk. That's a door standing open a long time, or something large enough to hold heat moving in and back out. I did my own count the next night, off the books, comparing what we'd actually received against what was stacked on the shelves. It didn't add up, not by a huge margin, but enough. There was a pallet's worth of floor space that should have had product on it, and instead had 3 layers of blue tarp zip-tied at the corners, shoved back past the fish crates into the corner. Nobody bothered checking. When I'd asked about that corner my first week, Ortiz told me it was damaged stock. Insurance was still sorting the claim. Leave it alone. I hadn't thought twice about it then. I thought about it plenty now. I brought it up casual to Reyes, one of the deckhands who usually ate breakfast in the galley, asked if he knew whatever happened with that damaged pallet, whether the claim ever got settled. His face changed before he even opened his mouth. Not scared exactly. More like a man remembering he'd left a stove burning somewhere back home. He told me to let it go, said some things on a ship aren't kitchen business. Then he got up and left half a plate of eggs on the table, and Reyes never left food unfinished in his life. That sat wrong enough that I went looking at the delivery manifest, which as a prep cook I had no real business pulling. But Ortiz kept the folder in the dry stores office, and the lock on that door had never worked right in 3 rotations. The pallet marked damaged, do not use, didn't match any incoming order from our last port of call. The paperwork stapled behind it listed a destination 2 stops ahead of where we were sailing, a port we weren't even scheduled to touch this trip. Damaged stock doesn't get a forward destination written on it. Damaged stock gets written off and dumped. This was headed somewhere. Around that same stretch of days, I started catching crew talk in the mess about Alvarez, one of the able seamen, who'd supposedly signed off at our last port to fly home for a family emergency. Except his sea bag was still under his bunk. His phone charger was still plugged in over the 3rd rack in berthing, and when I asked around, nobody could actually tell me who'd walked him down the gangway. Everybody just repeated what somebody else had told them. Nobody had watched it happen with their own eyes. I told myself I was building a story out of nothing, a bored brain filling in gaps at 2 in the morning, with whatever shape scared it most. But 3 nights later, I went into that walk-in alone, told myself I only wanted to look, and I found the zip tie on one corner of the tarp had worked loose. I got my hand maybe 6 inches under the plastic sheeting beneath it, just to feel what was there, and what I felt wasn't the give of a fish carton or a box of frozen chicken. It was the kind of give you feel pressing on a mattress when somebody's lying on the other side of it. I pulled my hand back so fast I knocked a hook rack off the wall, and I stood in that cold room a good while before my legs agreed to move again. I didn't sleep that whole day. I went looking for Ortiz to tell him what I'd felt, planning to frame it as a food safety issue, cross-contamination, anything that would get an officer into that walk-in with me standing right there as a witness. He wasn't in his cabin. The second mate told me he'd gone up to talk with the captain about some cargo paperwork and would be tied up most of the morning. When my shift ended that night and I went back down to show somebody, anybody, the tarp was already gone. The whole back corner sat swept clean, like nothing had ever been stacked there at all. 2 nights after that, I came into my own cabin and found my duffel zipped up the wrong way, the strap tucked backward from how I always leave it. Nothing missing that I could tell. Nothing broken or disturbed enough to report. Nobody said a single word to me about it, and nobody had to. I understood it the same way you understand a look somebody gives you across a crowded room. Someone wanted me to know they'd been in there, and they wanted me to know it without leaving me a single thing I could point to. I put in for a shift transfer the next morning, told the steward's office I wanted days instead of nights, family reasons, nothing specific. I figured on a week of back and forth before anybody even looked at the request. Instead, it got approved inside an hour, no questions asked, effective that same afternoon. And Ortiz personally came down to tell me not to worry about handing off my night duties. He'd already squared it away with the schedule. Nobody gets moved that fast on a ship running that short-handed. Nobody gets that kind of favor unless somebody further up the chain wants exactly what you want, which in my case was simply for me to stop looking. I finished out that rotation on days, ate breakfast at a normal hour, slept clean through the nights I used to spend standing in that cold room, listening for a door. I never caught the smell again after that. I never brought any of it up with Reyes either, and he never brought it up with me. Though every so often at the mess table his eyes would catch mine a beat too long before he looked back down at his plate. I signed off the Areto Sentinel at the end of that contract and didn't renew. About 8 months later, a friend still working freight forwarded me a maritime safety bulletin, the kind of thing that circulates quietly in the industry and never makes the regular news. There was a short entry near the bottom, 3 sentences, saying the Areto Sentinel had been flagged and boarded for inspection at a foreign port following an anonymous tip. Cargo hold contents listed as under review. No further details released pending investigation. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop and didn't go looking for anything else on it, because some part of me already knew I didn't want the rest of that story. And some part of me already had it anyway, sitting cold in the back of my mind, the way that smell used to sit in the back of that freezer, waiting for the door to open again. Elena Marsh had worked the graveyard audit on the Corinthia for 6 weeks when she first noticed the charge. It was a small thing, $4.50, a minibar item pulled from cabin 4114, posted at 3:14 in the morning. She almost didn't catch it. Night audits ran through hundreds of accounts, matching charges against room numbers, closing out the day's books before the ship's system reset at dawn. But cabin 4114 caught her eye, because the guest folio was supposed to be closed. The passenger, a man named Thomas Reyes, had disembarked in Miami 3 days earlier. His account should have been zeroed out, archived, done. She fixed it the way she'd fix any billing error, reversed the charge, flagged it as a system glitch, moved on. That should have been the end of it. But the next night, at 3:14 again, another charge posted to the same cabin, same amount, same time, down to the minute. She sat there in the quiet of the front office, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound at that hour, and felt the small, specific irritation of a computer doing something it wasn't supposed to do twice in a row. She started digging the following afternoon, before her shift, pulling the full history on 41114. The checkout looked clean on paper. Reyes's keycard had been deactivated at 8:42 in the morning, 3 days ago, standard procedure. The cabin had been cleaned, inspected, and reassigned that same day to a new passenger, a woman named Carol Whitfield, traveling alone on the second half of the cruise. Whitfield hadn't filed a single complaint. Her own charges were posting normally. Spa visits, dinner reservations, Nothing strange. But when Elena looked closer at the account structure, she found something the system shouldn't have allowed at all. Both names, Reyes and Whitfield, were still attached to the same cabin file, layered on top of each other like the ship had never actually closed the first booking before opening the second. That alone she might have written off as a database hiccup, the kind of thing IT support back on shore would fix with a shrug and a patch. What she couldn't write off was the sequence of the charge itself. She pulled the minibar sensor logs, the ones that recorded when a bottle or snack was physically removed from the unit, and compared them against the billing timestamp. In every legitimate transaction on the ship, the sensor triggered first, the item was logged as removed, and the charge posted seconds later once the system processed it. In cabin 4114, the charge posted first, every night. The billing entry existed a full 4 seconds before the sensor ever registered movement, as if the ship's computer knew what was about to happen before it happened. She sat with that for a long moment, the cursor blinking on her screen, and told herself there were a dozen boring explanations. A caching error, a clock drift between two subsystems that hadn't been synced properly since the last software update. She wrote it into her nightly report and left it for the day manager, expecting someone with more authority than her to make it disappear. Instead, 3 days later, she pulled the corridor camera footage, mostly out of habit, mostly because she couldn't sleep afterward, and had nothing better to do with the hour before her shift started. The camera outside, 4114, covered the full length of the hallway, and she scrubbed through the footage from all 3 nights the charge had posted. At 3:14, each night, the hallway was completely empty. No housekeeping cart, no late passenger stumbling back from the casino, nothing. But the door access log, which she cross-referenced afterward, showed the electronic lock cycling open for exactly 2 seconds at 3:14, then relocking. No card had been swiped. The system simply recorded the door as unlocked and then locked again, with no human event attached to either action. It was around then that she started asking around, carefully, the way you ask about something you don't want to sound foolish for asking about. She mentioned the room number to Danny, one of the bartenders who'd been on the Corinthia for 9 years, back when the ship had a different name and a different owner before the refit. She watched his face when she said 4114, and it wasn't nothing. He got quiet, wiped down a glass he'd already dried, and told her that number had a reputation among the older crew, though nobody talked about it much anymore, because most of the people who remembered why had transferred off or retired. What he told her, in pieces, over the next 2 nights, was that years ago, before the Corinthia had been rebuilt and renamed, a passenger had gone missing from that exact cabin midway through a crossing. No body was recovered. The official log listed it as a voluntary disembarkation at a port the ship never actually stopped at, a paperwork fiction that let the company close the file without an investigation. Danny didn't know if it was true or just the kind of story crew told each other to make long nights shorter, but he said the number had followed the room through 2 refits and 1 full renaming of the ship, and crew still avoided assigning it if they could help it. Elena went looking for the incident report anyway, because she was the kind of person who couldn't leave a loose thread alone, and she found it, buried in an archived folder that should have required clearance she didn't technically have, but that nobody had ever bothered to lock down. The report was heavily redacted, names blacked out, but the cabin number was still visible in 1 line that someone had missed when they scrubbed it, and the date lined up with what Danny had described almost exactly. 2 nights after that, Carol Whitfield came down to the front desk in person, in a robe, at 11 at night, and asked to be moved to a different cabin. She was embarrassed about it, kept saying it was probably nothing, but she said she'd been waking up around 3, most nights feeling like there was someone standing near the foot of the bed, gone the moment she opened her eyes. She hadn't wanted to say anything before, because it sounded ridiculous out loud. Elena moved her without hesitation and didn't tell her about the charges. That was the night Elena decided she would stay late and watch it happen instead of finding it after the fact. She told her supervisor she wanted to run a manual audit on the room system overnight, which wasn't exactly a lie. and set herself up at the desk with the live billing feed on one monitor and the corridor camera feed on the other, both windows open side by side, coffee going cold beside the keyboard. Cabin 4114 was empty now, unassigned, waiting for the next passenger to board at the following port. At 3:11, she watched the corridor feed the way you watch a pot you know isn't going to boil. And at 3:14, exactly the billing ledger updated itself in real time in front of her. A charge appeared in the account column, the same $4.50, attached to a folio that shouldn't have existed for a cabin with no guest in it. The corridor camera showed nothing move. But for the length of a single frame, maybe less than a second, the guest name field on the billing screen flickered from Thomas Reyes to another name entirely. 6 or 7 letters she caught only the shape of, before it reverted back to Reyes, as if it had never changed at all. She sat completely still afterward, her hands off the keyboard, listening to the air conditioning hum and telling herself she'd misread it, that eyes did that at 3 in the morning, after too much coffee and not enough sleep. She didn't sleep when her shift ended. Instead, she pulled the personnel file for the night audit position, going back through every name that had held her exact job on this ship, this specific graveyard rotation, over the past several years. What she found sat wrong in her stomach in a way the flickering name hadn't quite managed. Every single auditor who had worked this shift had left the position within a matter of weeks, either transferring to a different department, resigning outright with no notice period served, or in 2 cases simply not showing up for their next contract renewal. Her own hire date, she realized, lined up almost exactly with the resignation of the woman before her, close enough that it looked less like coincidence and more like a seat being kept warm. She closed the file and sat there in the empty front office as the ship's system clock ticked toward the end of her shift, the corridor camera for 4114 still open in the corner of her second monitor, out of habit now more than purpose. She thought about requesting a transfer herself, filling out the paperwork before her next contract, finding some department with normal hours and no ledgers that updated themselves. She thought about it seriously enough to open the form. Then a small notification chimed in the corner of her screen, the same soft tone the system used for every posted charge, and she looked up out of instinct before she could stop herself. It wasn't 4114. It was her own employee account, her own login. A single line item she hadn't entered, time-stamped 1 minute ahead of the actual time on the clock in front of her. She never did find out what it was a charge for. The field where the description should have been was simply blank, and by the time she refreshed the screen to check again, it was gone, as if it had already been closed out for the night. I'd been doing ship medicine for 3 years by then, and I thought that job had already shown me every kind of scared a parent's face could look like. I was wrong, and I found that out at 3 in the morning, somewhere past the halfway point of a 9-day crossing, when my radio cracked, and a voice I didn't recognize said the words, "Code Bright Boy, Deck 4, all clinical staff respond now." I'd never heard that code before. We had the normal ones, the ones you learn in your first week, color and number combinations for fires, and man overboard, and cardiac arrest. This wasn't one of them. I remember standing there in the medical bay, with my hand still on the radio, asking dispatch to repeat it, and the second time the voice said it slower, like they wanted to make sure I understood. This wasn't a drill, and it wasn't something they wanted said plainly, over an open channel, where a passenger walking past a speaker might hear it. When I got to the cabin, the first thing that hit me wasn't the smell or the noise, it was recognition. I knew this family. I'd seen the boy that same afternoon, a quick visit for seasickness, a little dehydrated, nothing that worried me. His mother had thanked me twice on the way out. Now she was on her knees on the cabin floor, holding him against her chest, and the sight of her face rewired something in my stomach immediately, because 12 hours earlier I had looked at this exact kid and told her he was fine. He wasn't fine. His lips had gone a color I didn't like, a dusky purple blue, but he had no fever, hadn't thrown up, wasn't reacting to anything the way I expected from the textbook cases. No hives, no known allergies on his intake form. Whatever this was, It didn't match anything I'd been trained to expect walking through that door, and for a few seconds, that mismatch scared me more than any obvious symptom could have. I found the answer by accident, in the bathroom trash, a small glass dropper bottle with foreign lettering on the label. When I held it up, the father admitted they'd given him a few drops before bed, something they'd picked up at a pharmacy stall during our last port stop. A natural sleep remedy the vendor had recommended for restless kids on long trips. They hadn't thought to mention it because to them it wasn't medicine. It was just something local mothers used. In one breath, the entire shape of the emergency changed. This wasn't a virus or an allergic reaction working through his system. This was a substance somebody had put into his body on purpose, thinking it was harmless. I called for the ship's doctor next and got nothing. Not a delayed answer. Nothing at all. It took another 2 minutes of dead air before the bridge told me what nobody had told me at the start of my shift, that Dr. Patel had disembarked early at the last port for a family emergency of his own, and the relief physician wasn't boarding until we reached the next scheduled stop. For tonight, medically speaking, it was me and an off-duty security officer named Robbie, who'd done EMT training a decade earlier. That was the entire staff standing between this kid and whatever was happening inside him. The captain got on the radio not long after that, with worse news. There was weather moving through our corridor, low visibility, high wind, nothing a helicopter could fly into. Nearest port, with a real hospital, was over 6 hours out, even at full speed. And full speed through that swell wasn't something the ship could safely do either. Whatever was going to happen to this boy was going to happen here, in a cabin the size of a walk-in closet, with whatever I could find in a locked cabinet down the hall. Which is where the next problem showed up. When I pulled the emergency kit for anything that might counteract a sedative overdose in a small child, half of what should have been there wasn't. There'd been an incident the month before, an elderly passenger, and the stock had been drawn down and never fully replenished. A paperwork gap nobody had caught because nobody expected to need it twice in one contract. I remember standing in front of that half-empty cabinet, doing math in my head about what I actually had, instead of what I was supposed to have. What I did have was a satellite phone and a telemedicine line the company kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. So I used it, reading vitals to a physician on shore, while Robbie held a flashlight steady over the boy's arm so I could get a line in on a small moving vessel in rough water. I sent a photo of the bottle through on a slow connection, and it took almost 4 minutes for the doctor on the other end to write back, and when she did, her tone had changed completely. This wasn't some mild herbal tincture. It was a compounded cough and sedative preparation, sold over the counter in some countries, pulled from shelves in others, years earlier, after it was linked to cardiac problems in small children, who metabolized the dose differently than adults did. Not long after that, his heart rhythm went somewhere I didn't want to see it go, and for close to a minute, doing compressions on a kid I'd cleared as healthy that same afternoon, I genuinely did not know if I was going to get him back. The physician on the line talked me through a drug substitution I never would have reached for on my own. A dosing adjustment built around what was actually sitting in that cabinet instead of the textbook answer, and it worked. His rhythm came back ragged, then steadied, and by the time the relief doctor met us at the next port, the boy was stable enough to walk off the ship holding his mother's hand instead of on a stretcher. I thought that was the end of it, until a few weeks later, filing my incident report, I got copied on an internal email chain by mistake. Buried in it was a reference to an almost identical case on a sister ship 2 years earlier, quietly resolved. No advisory ever sent down to crews about the product or the port it came from. Nobody had covered anything up outright. It had just been treated as one bad night instead of a pattern, and that gap in memory was the thing that nearly cost this family their son. That's the part of the job nobody warns you about when you sign the contract. It's not the emergencies themselves, you get numb to those fast enough. It's realizing how much of your ability to save someone depends on systems you can't see and can't control, run by people who've never stood in that cabin at 3 in the morning with their hands on a kid's chest. I keep my own private log now, check expiration dates myself, instead of trusting the manifest. And every time I hear a strange code come over that radio, some part of me still goes back to that boy's face, and the word bright, stitched right there on the collar of the pajama shirt his mother never got to change him out of that night. I got the contract 4 days after my 24th birthday, a 6-month run singing and dancing in the main theater of a mid-sized ship called the Meridian Star, and for the first 2 months it felt like the best decision I'd ever made. 2 shows a night, 6 nights a week, a cast of 14 who ate together, slept 2 decks below the guests, and complained about the same things: the recycled air, the captain's habit of announcing rough seas 5 minutes before we went on, the guy in wardrobe who never returned costumes on time. It was a job, and I loved it, and I want that on record before I tell you the rest, because after a while it stopped being simple. The late show ran at 11:15, smaller crowd than the 7 o'clock, mostly couples who'd had a few drinks and wanted something low-key before bed. Maybe 60 people scattered across 200 seats. Easy to read a room that size. You learn the shapes of an audience fast when you're up there 5 nights a week. Who's tired? Who's drunk? Who's on their phone? So when a man in a gray suit showed up in the back row on a Tuesday in my 6th week, I noticed him the way you notice anything that doesn't match. Everyone else was in shorts and sundresses, sunburned, half asleep. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, jacket buttoned, and he didn't check his phone once during the whole 40 minutes. He didn't drink, he didn't move, he just watched. And it wasn't the polite watching people do at a show. It was closer to studying. I told myself it was a widower killing time, or someone who'd lost a bet with their spouse and had to sit through the young people's review alone. I forgot about him by the next morning. Then Wednesday night, same seat, same suit, same stillness. And I felt something small and specific shift in my chest. Not fear yet. More like the feeling of noticing a word you've never seen before, and then suddenly seeing it everywhere. I mentioned it to Des, one of the other dancers, backstage between numbers. "Got myself a stalker," I said, half joking, and he laughed and said, maybe the guy just liked the choreography. It was funny for about 4 more nights. By the following Monday, I'd stopped finding it funny, because the seat was never sold to anyone else, and he was always in it before the house lights dropped, and always gone by the time they came back up. I asked a friend in guest services, a woman named Coral who ran the box office, if she could pull the manifest for that seat. Theater seating on a cruise isn't ticketed like a Broadway house, but the system logs keycard scans at the door for head count and safety musters. She humored me. What she came back with 3 days later made the hair on my arms actually stand, and I don't say that lightly. The card scan for that seat section on 4 of those 5 nights matched a guest who, according to the ship's own tracking, was somewhere else entirely. Once at the casino bar, twice already checked into their cabin for the night, once on a shore excursion in Cozumel that hadn't returned to the ship until midnight, an hour after the show ended. I decided it had to be a prank. We'd all heard stories about crew hazing new hires, fake ghost passengers, rigged cabin doors, a costume closet supposedly haunted by a dresser from some earlier contract. A guy in the AV booth confirmed there was a running joke on some ships about a phantom passenger who got assigned to whichever performer was newest, and I latched onto that explanation because it was the only one that let me sleep. I marched up to Des and 2 of the other dancers and accused them outright, half laughing, half not, and they swore up and down it wasn't them. Then Nils, our stage manager, a quiet guy who'd been with the company almost 6 years, went pale in a way that made the joke curdle in my mouth. He said he'd seen the same man once, his second contract, different ship, same suit, same seat, position relative to the stage. He'd assumed it was a prank too. Nobody ever admitted to running it, on either ship, and after a while he'd stopped asking. That should have been the moment I let it go. Instead, I decided to catch him. I had one of the ushers, a kid named Priya, lock the rear exit doors 2 minutes before the final bow, so nobody could slip out during blackout, which was the only window he ever seemed to use. I spent the whole finale watching the back row instead of my mark, missed a lyric, and when the lights came up, the seat was empty. Not just empty of him, empty like no one had been near it in days. Except the cushion. The cushion held a clear impression, the kind that takes real weight and real time to leave. And folded neatly on the armrest sat that night's show program, squared off at perfect right angles, the way I fold programs myself out of habit, and nobody else on that crew does. I asked security to pull the theater cameras for that section, expecting either an answer or at least a shape on the footage I could point to and say, "There, that's him." What I got instead was worse than either. 4 nights of footage, all time-stamped, to match when Priya, 2 ushers, and I had all separately clocked him sitting there, and on every single frame, the seat was empty. Not blurred, not obscured. Empty. The whole show. The whole time. On camera. While 4 of us would have sworn under oath there was a man in a gray suit, sitting in it not 15 feet from the lens. I stopped sleeping well after that. I started asking around about the ship's history instead of the seat, which felt safer somehow, more like research than panic. An older crew member in food service, who'd been sailing with the company for over a decade, told me about a performer 9 years back. A tenor, she thought his name was Julian, who died during a Caribbean run. Fell from an upper crew deck around 3 in the morning, ruled an accident, no note, no clear reason. She said the show ran 2 nights later anyway, his understudy stepping into the same numbers, same blocking, because that's the culture on these ships. The show must go on, whatever's happened below decks, whatever nobody's talking about at breakfast. I found an old cast photo in a binder in the box office archive, programs going back over a decade, and when I got to that particular season, I sat there for a long time. The resemblance wasn't perfect. It was close enough that my stomach dropped anyway. I told Coral what I'd found, expecting her to go quiet the way Nils had. Instead, she laughed, not unkindly, and said every ship in the fleet had some version of that story attached to it. Always a dead performer, always a different name, always conveniently impossible to verify, because contracts end and people scatter, and nobody keeps records long enough to check. She'd heard the same tale on 2 other ships with 2 other names. It was folklore, she said, the kind that gets inherited by whoever's new and anxious enough to go looking for a pattern. I wanted to believe her. Some nights I did. My contract ended in late October, and on my last late show, I decided not to hide from it anymore. He was there, same row, same stillness, and instead of stealing glances, I turned and held his gaze straight through the final number, the way you're taught never to do with an audience member, because it breaks the illusion. For the first time in 5 months, he reacted. Nothing dramatic, just the smallest tilt of his head, like someone acknowledging they'd been seen. After the show, a woman I didn't know, a passenger, stopped me near the atrium and said, unprompted, that she always noticed the guy in the gray suit who never claps, and asked if he worked for the ship. I told her I didn't know. It was the first time anyone outside my own crew had confirmed they'd seen him too, and somehow that was worse than any camera footage could have been. I flew home 2 days later and told myself it was over. The way you tell yourself a lot of things once distance makes them feel smaller. 4 months after that, Des texted me a photo from the same theater, same late show, new lead performer in my old spot. He said he'd been filming a bit of her number to send the group chat, and only noticed afterward what was sitting in the back row of the frame, a shape in a dark suit, not quite sharp enough to call a face, facing the camera dead on, even though Des swore he'd never once pointed his phone at that seat. I still have that photo saved. I've shown it to exactly 3 people. None of them can tell me what it is, and neither can I. And the show is still running 6 nights a week without me, the way it always does, whether anyone in that back row is real or not.